Well, Sully's on the couch. Scout's here in the picture. You're ready. I guess I'm ready. So let's get started on today's topic. This is a request by a viewer. We're going to talk about the timeline of the Korean War. And this is just an overview. The Korean War went on for several years, although it was a relatively short war, as wars go, but it went on for, a long time. So we're just going to kind of do an overview. Why did it start? Who all was involved? And what happened? Kind of thing. The beginning of the Korean War actually is involved with the end of World War II. World War II ended in 1945. There was a lot of territory that the German army had taken and that the the Japanese army had taken, and all of that had to be kind of handled and governments reestablished and things taken care of in those countries. And so they were kind of split up between the major allied countries. The Korean Peninsula was one of those territories that the Japanese had. So it was decided that the Korean Peninsula would be split between the United States and the Russians, the USSR. So in August of 1945, two young people, you know what, let me share my screen and start with the stuff that you need to be able to see. As always, I am perfectly prepared and have mad technical skills. This is the North Korean Peninsula, or I'm sorry, the Korean Peninsula. This is China here. Over here is Russia. That kind of gives you an idea of where we're talking about. And we know a peninsula is a piece of land that hangs down into the ocean and is surrounded by three sides on the ocean, kind of like Florida. This is like the Asian version of Florida, except not really, just as far as the landform is concerned. So, as I said, it was split between the United States and the USSR, which is Russia. And at some point in August of 1945, two young men who were aides in the State Department divided the Korean Peninsula up along the 38th parallel, this line right here, and decided that the north part would belong to Russia and the south part would belong to the US. Everybody was in agreement with this, and so that's how that went. Now, there were now two Koreas. There was North Korea, which was controlled by this man, Kim Il-sung, who is actually the grandfather of the guy who's in charge in, in North Korea today, Kim Jong-un. So they stuck together there for a little while. And South Korea, which was in charge of a man named Syngman Rhee. Now, neither one of these guys was real keen on the idea that there are now two Koreas. They both wanted there to be one Korea, and they wanted to be in charge of it. So the United States was kind of reluctantly backing Syngman Rhee. They didn't like him that much, but he was the best they had. And the Russians were enthusiastically backing Kim Il-sung because he wanted to take over South Korea and they wanted to too. So there was constant fighting between the two sides back and forth over the 38th parallel, to the point that more than 10,000 soldiers were killed. North Korean and South Korean soldiers were killed before the war was even really declared to be a war. So it was a potential hotspot for a good little while. Okay, on June the 25th of 1950, the North Korean People's Army crossed over into South Korea and attacked the city of Seoul. Seoul was then and is still now the capital of South Korea. The capital of South Korea was apparently unprepared for this, and it fell within 3 days of fighting. The US President Harry Truman was very concerned about this because they had this idea at the time that communism was looking to spread across the entire world, and they had even had a in 1950, a UN, the United Nations National Security Council report had recommended that force be used to contain communism anywhere it seemed to be expansionism, anywhere it seemed to be occurring, quote, regardless of the intrinsic strategic or economic value of the lands in question, unquote. So wherever you see communism popping up, you need to try to stop that, no matter if it's going to affect your country, no matter if the lands are worth anything to you, or, you know, there's any strategic value to the lands. Need to stop it. You need to stop it right now. Nip it in the bud, as that old guy on Andy Griffith used to say, Barney Fife used to say. So they decided that they were going to have to send in troops to South Korea to stop the spread of communism. So who fought in this war? Well, North Korea was supported by the Soviet Union, which was Russia, and Communist China. South Korea was supported by a whole bunch of people. There were more than 55 nations that contributed to the South Korean cause. They sent troops, they sent supplies, or they sent other forms of aid. 21 countries actively sent troops. The main ones were the United States, Great Britain, and other members of the United Nations. The United States, before the war was over, would send approximately 5.3 million troops from the beginning to the end of the war. So this was kind of a big deal. And there were more than 3 million troops on the North Korean side from the Chinese and the Russian troops. So it got big and ugly pretty fast. At first, it was a defensive war. The US just wanted to make sure that the North Koreans didn't come any further south. They wanted to push them back to the 38th parallel and then just sit there and keep them from coming any further. And that wasn't working out really, really well for the Americans. The North Korean army was very well trained, they were well disciplined, and they were well equipped. The South Korean army was not. I think the Russians had spent some time training people, and the Americans had not. And so that was beginning to kind of show. So in the summer, and on top of that, it was one of the hottest summers on record, the summer of 1950. And the Americans were not really well supplied with water at that point, clean water, and so they ended up having to drink water out of the rice paddies. A rice paddy is a field where they grow rice, and rice grows underwater. So they dig these fields down and then flood them with water. And apparently, at that point in Korean history, what they were using to fertilize the rice paddies was human waste. So they were putting that into the water, and now these American soldiers are drinking this water. So ew, and that can create a whole lot of potential for intestinal problems and diseases. Cholera comes from drinking contaminated water. Lots of diseases come from drinking contaminated water, and this water was seriously contaminated. So all of these things were a constant threat. And by the end of the summer, President Truman and Douglas MacArthur, who is the general in charge of the US forces, had decided to try something a little different. And they decided that they were going to invade North Korea and just go ahead and wipe communism out of Korea altogether. And it was going to be a one Korea, but it was not going to be a communist Korea. So they staged an amphibious assault landing. Think of like the Normandy landings, only much, much smaller, at a place called Incheon. Are you okay there, Scout? On September the 15th of 1950. They were able to push all of the North Koreans back past the 38th parallel, and the Americans invaded North Korea, and they were pushing up towards the Yalu River, which is the border between North Korea and China. Well, now the Chinese began to get concerned about this, and they began to mobilize as well, because they were like, well, they're going to come on in and take over North Korea. What's going to stop them from coming on in and taking us over too? So they began to mobilize and get ready for this, which led to the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir. I can't even talk this morning, I'm sorry. This was a really extensive battle. It took place over a period of 17 days, November the 26th, 1950 through December the 13th, 1950. It was at a place in North Korea, very close to the Chinese border. There were 4 Marine and Army divisions who had pushed up almost to the Yalu River. And they met up with 33 Chinese divisions at the Chosin Reservoir. Now, 33 is a lot bigger than 4. And they did not realize their intelligence was not good. The information that they had was not good. They did not realize what they were walking into. When they got there, all of a sudden there were Chinese soldiers everywhere, and they were basically almost surrounded and definitely outnumbered. And on top of that, the weather was horrible. Generally, when you have a battle like this, you would dig entrenchments and put up sandbags and that sort of thing too, as places to get behind so that you're protected from the firing of the other people. The ground was way too hard. They couldn't dig into the ground without explosives because it was frozen solid. And so what they ended up having to do in a lot of cases was pile up dead bodies to hide behind. The temperatures dropped to the point that a lot of the time the temperature was below 0. I believe I read that it got as low as 40 degrees below 0. This was horrible conditions to fight in. So the United States Army and the Marines began to retreat. And they basically had to fight their way backwards for 70 miles until they could get to the sea and get sea lifted out, get on a ship and get lifted out. Many of the men suffered frostbite to the point where they lost their feet. Some of them lost their hands. They lost pieces of their hands. So some of them lost their whole hands. Some of them lost their whole feet, because frostbite is when your skin and the blood vessels inside it freeze. And if it's just your skin, that freezes, a lot of times they can bring that back and it'll be okay. But if like your whole foot freezes for a really long time, then the blood supply inside there dies. And basically now it's just this big hunk of dead meat on the end of your foot. I know that's gross and I'm sorry, but that's what happened to a lot of these men. I read reports where even some of them would be shot outside, and they would go in and be warming up in the tents. And apparently the hole where they had been shot had frozen, so that they didn't realize they were shot as bad as they were until they started to warm up. And then they would bleed to death inside the tent. I mean, it's crazy. It's horrible. So that's where we are. This is our first big encounter with the Chinese army, and it went badly. So General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the US forces, as I said before, and he wanted to expand the war and go ahead and invade China and then the USSR and just wipe communism off the face of the earth. Now we're 5 years past the end of World War II. President Truman was the one who had to order who did order the nuclear weapons dropped on Japan, the 2 nuclear bombs dropped on Japan. And he didn't want to order that ever again. He didn't want to have to use nuclear weapons. And he was very concerned because by this time, the Russians also have nuclear weapons. And he was afraid we would get into a war with both sides having nuclear weapons. And this is not going to go well for anybody, because he basically decided the best way to win a nuclear war is not to ever have one. And he did not want to expand the war. He did not want to get into another huge war. He basically thought this was going to be World War III, and we weren't ready for it. And so he was trying very hard not to expand the war into China, while Douglas MacArthur was trying to push his way into China and provoke the Chinese into basically declaring war on the US. to the point that MacArthur actually sent a letter to a congressman. Did I write his name down? Yes, his name was Joseph Martin, and he was a House Republican leader. And he also believed we should just go ahead and wipe communism out. And so MacArthur wrote a letter to him saying that there is no substitute for victory against international communism, and basically that we were wimping out and we weren't gonna do anything. We were just gonna hold the line, and that was gonna be a failure. He sent the letter, MacArthur sent the letter to this man, knowing that this man, Joseph Martin, would leak the letter to the press, and now maybe the American public would be behind him and everybody would want to expand this war. Well, a lot of people did, but the main one who didn't was President Truman. And apparently MacArthur kind of forgot that he worked for President Truman, because on April the 11th, 1951, Truman fired him. He relieved him of command, kicked him out of the army, sent him home, and told him, that's it, man, you are not in charge of this anymore. People were shocked. But he was fired for insubordination, which is not following orders. So after MacArthur was relieved of command, peace talks actually began at a city called Panmunjom, but the fighting continued while the peace talks were going on. Both sides of the two Koreas agreed that the 30th parallel should be the border, but what they really disagreed about was the forced repatriation of the POWs, the prisoners of war. Now, what that means is North Korea said, you've got a lot of our guys that you captured. We want them back, period. We want them back, whether they want to come back to North Korea or not. And the people in South Korea said, we got a lot of your guys and we're sending them back if they want to go. We want all of our people back, South Korea said, but we're only going to give you yours back if they choose to go. Because communism is a very authoritarian sort of place. The government makes all of the decisions. And I know that a lot of things are happening, and we're getting compared, the US is getting compared to having an authoritarian government. It's nothing like this. Back when communism was really rampant, we're down to only having one communist country now. But there were instances where it was very common for the Soviet leaders to come in and look at people that were getting ready to go out of school and into the workplace. And it was, okay, you're going to be a farmer, and you're going to be a farmer, and you're going to be a farmer. You get to go to school to be a doctor. And, they chose what you did. We need doctors. You three are going to be doctors. The rest of you are going to be farmers. And you didn't get to choose. I don't want to be a farmer. I want to start my own Etsy business. Nothing like that. You did what you were told. They could even take your children away if they showed promise with gymnastics or sports of some kind. They would take the children away and raise them in like schools where, they taught them some stuff, but mostly they just worked on gymnastics. So that's why they had such great Olympic teams, because they raised these children. Their parents had no say in it. That's an authoritarian government. So that's what the big disagreement was. These people, a lot of them, they're in South Korea and they're deciding, we don't want to go back. An armistice, which is a ceasefire agreement, was reached on July the 27th of 1953. The POWs were allowed to choose whether they went home or not. That was finally agreed on. An extra 1,500 square miles of territory was given to South Korea, and that established the 2-mile-wide demilitarized zone. No treaty was ever actually signed. All they have is this armistice between the two countries. So technically, the war's not actually over because no treaty was ever signed. The demilitarized zone, called the DMZ, is still there. There are still US troops on that border. I think it's somewhere like just under 3,000 troops up there now. it's just kind of we don't like each other, but we're not actually shooting at each other right now. Casualties. 1.2 million South Koreans were killed. 1 million North Koreans were killed. 36,500 US troops were killed, and I read that like 100,000 American troops were wounded. 600,000 Chinese troops were killed, and nearly half of all of the Korean deaths were civilians. This was the highest civilian death toll of any war that we've had so far, including World War II and Vietnam. There is a Korean War memorial near the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And you see here that it is called the Forgotten War. It's because we don't talk about the Korean War a whole lot, to the point that even when it was going on, they weren't calling it a war, they were calling it a police action. So it didn't get covered by the news very often. Not much was said about it. We don't learn a whole lot about it in school generally. But this is what happened. These guys that were there did not forget about it. And we should remember what happened there too. Now, what most of us know about the Korean War is from a TV show called MASH. MASH stood for Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. Say one word before you try to say the next one. This works out better that way. It ran on the air from 1972 to 1983. It was actually on the air more than 3 times as long as the Korean War lasted. It was a very popular show. There were 106 million viewers who watched the MASH series finale. It's the most viewers that ever watched a TV show finale, still to the day that I'm telling you this. At some point it will be passed up, but right now it hasn't been. And the sets for the show was so popular that the sets from this show are actually on display at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. Now, this is a picture of the original cast. There were a lot of cast member changes. It went on for over 10 years. This gentleman here is Corporal Klinger, and he was wearing a dress because he was trying to convince the Army that he was crazy and he didn't belong in the Army, so they would send him home. They never did send him home, and he wore a dress a large part of the time and wore some very stylish outfits, but it was because he was trying to convince them he was crazy, and they just never did buy it. If you're interested in this show, it gives a very skewed version of the war, as all sitcoms do. Everything is kind of turned up to 11. It's streaming on Hulu if you have Hulu, but check with your parents before you watch anything without their permission. Okay. Stop that. Okay. That is all I have for you today. Now remember, this is just an overview, a very short look at a very complicated situation. As always, if you're interested in learning more about this, talk to your school librarian or talk to your librarian at the library in your town, wherever you are. Librarians know lots of stuff and they can help you find good things to read. Thank you for being here with me. If there is anything you would like me to talk about, please let me know in the comments. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you enjoyed this. I guess that we're done for today. All right, Sully, I think we're done, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.